Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katja Guenther, and I'm presenting today with my collaborator and co-conspirator, Kristen Hassan. Kristen and I ended up working together because of our shared commitment to improving the life chances of companion animals and the people who care for them. I'm a faculty member at the University of California in Riverside, where my research in feminist animal studies for the last decade or so has focused on the reproduction of inequalities based on gender, race, species, and disability. Kristen has over a decade of experience directing 3 large government animal shelters in the United States and now provides consulting and education for hundreds of others. She and I found each other following the publication of my book, The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals, and we found that my experience studying animal shelters and trap, neuter, release, or TNR programs from a scholarly perspective, and her background directing and supporting animal shelters gave us each unique knowledge sets that really helped enrich the others. What we're sharing with you today is our vision and progress for rethinking animal sheltering in the United States. Some parts of this presentation draw on a paper that we recently published, and we include information about that paper towards the end of this presentation for those of you who are interested in reading more. Our take-home message from our conversation with you today is this: while change is always possible, once an institution is set up with certain ruling beliefs and practices, the path of least resistance typically becomes what has always been done, which is not always what's in the best interest of animals or humans. Right now, we're seeing a major crisis in the US animal sheltering industry, and we propose that we can best resolve that crisis by recognizing the problems that the history of US sheltering has left for us as its legacy, and to try to start anew. For those of you joining from outside of the United States, our message has some universality, and we hope others can learn from not emulating the United States. Be mindful of what beliefs and practices are entrenched or are becoming entrenched in the systems of care or animal care in your country or region, and work towards new ways of thinking and acting when you see beliefs and practices that harm animals or people starting to become entrenched. Next slide, please. No doubt people in the United States love companion animals. The US has one of the highest per capita companion animal populations in the world. But there are also a lot of barriers here in the United States to guardianship of companion animals, including significant inequality in wealth and income that makes it difficult for some people to be able to afford the care for the animals who they love, and a major undersupply of animal-friendly rental housing. The outcome is that about 5% of all owned companion animals in the United States will pass through a shelter each year. For a number of reasons, animal shelters in the US are currently under tremendous strain. Next slide, please. With outcomes including substantial overcrowding, difficulty facilitating adoptions, lack of enrichment and basic care for impounded animals, and increases in the percentage and number of animals being killed. In 2023, US shelters killed at least 50,000 more dogs than they did in 2019, the year before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Among the trends we've observed over the last few years are decreases in adoption rates and in transfers to shelters with an undersupply of animals. Next slide, sorry. Higher numbers of dogs killed than cats, and also substantially longer shelter stays. So how did the US sheltering industry get here? To a substantial degree by doing what they, or we, have always done, by viewing animals who are free roaming as out of place and in need of containment, by impounding animals in cages and facilities, and by disrupting human-animal relationships, and endorsing killing as a solution. Next slide, please. So we talk in our paper, and I'll highlight here again the idea of the pound model, which is the underlying model upon which the animal shelters were developed in the mid to late 1800s in the United States. And they have this set of underlying assumptions that continue to govern how animal shelters operate today. Again, holding that free roaming animals always need to be contained, that local governments are the appropriate agencies to develop and enforce animal welfare regulations, that shelters should utilize cages and other structures of containment to rein in all free-roaming companion animals, and that somehow killing animals is the only way to resolve a crisis of so-called overpopulation. Next slide, please. When we look at these images that date back to the 1850s, we can see these different logics of the pound model in action, where we see dog catchers chasing down purportedly stray dogs and tying them up in facilities designated for impoundment, where they can be reclaimed, which looks like it might be the case in the image with the white woman holding a small dog, or most of the time these dogs being killed, as we see in the drawing on my bottom left, of dogs being put into a cage and drowned. Next slide. While there have been many changes to shelters and their practices since the founding of animal sheltering and the development of the pound model in the United States, the underlying beliefs and practices have not actually shifted. We can explain this through a theoretical perspective called path dependence, which emphasizes how institutions struggle to redirect from entrenched ideologies and actions. Once we set off in a certain direction on a path, it becomes increasingly challenging to move off of that path into a new direction. Next slide, and I'll turn it over to Kristen to talk about some of the legacies of the pound model.
Thank you, Katja. Before I talk a little bit about this, I just want to say that though our paper offers a critical analysis, we recognize the tireless efforts of the countless people who have made animal shelters so much better. And there has been so much progress made, yet the system is still highly problematic. And so our critique is really directed at the system itself. And there's three areas where the legacies are felt in everything that we do in animal shelters today. The first one is the institutional culture that rears its head every time the shelter system comes under strain. Once capacity is hit and more animals are coming in than are leaving, the system immediately pressures the animal shelter to euthanize animals for space to make room for incoming animals. And indeed, in this past couple of years, what we've seen is that intakes have been outpacing outcomes nationally, which means there are headlines across the country in shelters of all sizes like this one. This one says hundreds of dogs are getting euthanized due to overpopulation and maxed out shelters. Number two is that lack of transparency and invisibility has always defined the problem for animal shelters. Most of what happens in animal shelters isn't really seen by the public. And once an animal goes in, there is no transparency about what happens to them. We don't have federal or state mandated reporting requirements. And so even basic data is fairly unknown. I use this image of a dog in a shelter that I was consulting with. And if you look at the dates, the animal came in sometime in 2020. It looks like 1/20/120. And this animal is listed as available a full 2 years later, actually more than 2 years later in 2022. And yet we know nothing about this animal's history. We know it says rescue only, which indicates there may be some issue, but this is the norm in the largest shelters in the United States now. And so animals are often, their stories are just disconnected from them. So we really don't know who they are, and we're not able to understand what is really happening to animals as they move through the system. And then the third is economic disparities. And we see that in communities that do face greater economic challenges, where people are poorer, a greater number of animals generally enter, and that animal shelters are funded much differently and supported much differently. So in this graph, this is from a presentation that I did for the ASPCA, and you'll see that, and these are real shelters, they're just de-identified. In one shelter, we may have 21,000 animals coming in and a $3.5 million budget. In another, we may have 8,000 coming in and a $22 million budget. And these disparities mean that some shelters simply cannot provide humane care and take every animal and get most of them out alive. They just cannot do it. And this also is hidden largely from public view. This is the result of what we're seeing, particularly the last couple of years. These are pictures taken over this past year in shelters in the United States. Animals are kept in extremely crowded conditions. And in most cases, it's because there is a desire to save these animals. There's a desire to give them more than the 3-day average stray hold to get animals out alive. But unfortunately, we're seeing on the right, you see a euthanasia list. More and more euthanasia lists simply because there are no kennels for incoming animals. And so shelters are forced to euthanize enough animals for the animals to come in the next day. There has been one standout disruption to all of this, and that is TNR and SNR, trap, neuter, return, also called trap, neuter, vaccinate, return in the United States, has been tremendously successful. And last year, for the first time, we saw that fewer cats were euthanized in US shelters than dogs. And cats are faring much better in this moment because so much community investment has been made into TNR programs. And there's a few images here, but I just want to shout out the Million Cat Challenge. Dr. Julie Levy, who's been a leader in this space for a long time at the University of Florida, both Jackson Galaxy and Hannah Shaw, also named the Kitten Lady. They're all helping the community get on board with the idea that we can care for cats in the community, and we don't have the same thing for dogs. And because we have this for cats, both to a popular audience and to a shelter audience, we've made great strides with cat. And Dr. Levy just did a spay clinic last weekend, and they did 700 surgeries in one weekend. So really amazing stuff happening there, and also a lesson for us about what is possible. We wanted to share a little bit from our paper to say that while it does seem a bit hopeless, and right now it seems very hopeless, the institutional culture of take in every animal and then euthanize, kill animals if you are too full to get them out alive, that is really front and center of our minds right now, as shelters are the most crowded they've been in a really long time. But there is a way forward. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that is happening even now in the midst of all the challenges we're facing. One, there are greater discussions happening about community dog management and how in certain areas we can imagine a future where we do TNR and community dog population management in certain parts of the United States. Currently, outside of very limited areas, community dog population management simply isn't happening in the US. Community lost pet reunification. What really strikes us is that most animals coming into shelters in the US are not coming in because owners can no longer keep them. More than 50% of intakes are stray animals. They're just animals that are lost from their owners. And Petco Love Lost is a platform. It's a free nonprofit platform that lets people reunite pets in the field using facial recognition. There's really not a need for dogs to come into shelters anymore if there's an owner looking for them. Practicing co-housing and handling animals differently than we have been. Animals are mostly kept in solitary isolation kennels by themselves in US shelters. That is changing with playgroups and co-housing to give the animals better quality of life when they do have to come into the shelter. And fourth is the foster-centric model, which at the time of the pandemic was a transition that the US made very quickly. A full 42% of all sheltered animals went to foster homes at the beginning of the pandemic, and this happened in other countries as well. And so we know it's possible. And so moving towards a world in which foster is the norm for animals rather than being housed in a shelter kennel. Just a couple more, we're looking at pet inclusive housing and how to make housing more inclusive for animals. The problem now isn't so much of a shelter problem, it's really a medium and large dog problem because the housing for medium and large dogs is so very limited. It's such a tiny fraction of rental housing. So there are people like HABRI, the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, who are working on this to change this. We also are practicing community-driven animal services, providing support in communities for the basic things people need: grooming, sterilization, and even nail clipping, as you see here. Self-rehoming services are becoming more popular. Adopt a Pet, who is a pet adoption platform used by shelters, started a program called Rehome, where people can rehome their own pets without them coming into the shelter. Again, decentering the shelter from the work and trying to provide the bulk of services person to person in the community. And then last is coordinated intake, coordinated entry. In the old days, we took in every single animal. As you saw those animals in cages in New York waiting to be drowned, every animal was rounded up. And now many shelters are working towards a more coordinated intake system so that only the animals that truly need to come into the shelter do. This is Riverside, where they, in their first 6 months of this program, kept 4,000 animals from coming into the shelter just by offering people help and resources. And we want to just mention that ICAM and IFAW have been absolutely critical to our journey in the United States, learning about the possibility of even having different models. So the dog population management resources have been key to us even being able to envision a different future. If you want to follow us and keep up with all of the discussions we're continuing to have about this, I am on LinkedIn talking about this every single day. Katja and I both have websites, and so we invite you to please check us out. Check out the paper, Coming to Terms with the Legacies of the Pound Model in Animal Sheltering in the United States. We'd love to hear your feedback and love to connect with you on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for having us present.
Thank you.